Hi, I'm James, and today we are taking a look at the ASUS MiniPC PN50, and this particular model is the AMD Ryzen 4300U with the Renoir based APU, and this is a NUC style PC, but obviously with the AMD hardware as you would typically find in Renoir based laptops. I had hoped to buy a Ryzen 4700U model, however just stock availability here in the UK was terrible. My order was originally for late September, then early October, then it moved to November, December. Cancelled it for my use, I just need a 4300U really. The 8 core would have been nice, but this cost saving is probably worth having. So inside we have the unit itself. Although it is like a brushed metal appearance, this is actually a plastic chassis, so probably a little cheaper to produce than the Intel NUCs in that regard. And then going through the rest of the contents of the box, we have first of all our selection of screws for feet, M2 mounting and so on. We have a driver CD, which is slightly odd since there is no CD drive or DVD drive on this device. We have our usual selection of safety manuals, quick starts, warranty, tech specs, which we will be ignoring. We have the power brick, which is your standard sort of ASUS style power supply, so not particularly large, square design with rounded edges, and the power cable to go with it. And then last of all, we also have the Visa mount. Not something that I'll be using in this case, but for if you want to mount the device to the back of a monitor. So looking at the unit itself, and we have it here alongside a 6th generation NUC, which is actually the unit that I will be replacing with it. Primary reason for the change is just HDMI 2.0 support on the Renoir APU versus HDMI 1.4 on the NUC. I had been able to get HDMI 2 on the NUC using a DisplayPort adapter, but it never worked perfectly with my TV, and particularly with Now TV I got some stuttering during playback, so always ended up just using it 1080p, and I want to move to a proper 4K output with this. Looking at the front of the device, you have a single front USB port for USB-A, and then a USB-C, and this is a, I believe, USB 3.2 Gen 2 port. Then we also have infrared receiver, similar to you will find on this. Headphone socket, again similar to the NUC. And one thing which you don't get on the NUC is you have this micro SD slot. Another thing I like is that the power button is actually on the front. On the NUCs this is on the top, and it means if you want to stack anything on top of these, or if you want to have multiple units stacked, you can't get to the power buttons, which can be a bit of an inconvenience. The micro SD slot as well, quite nice and useful to have if you want to plug in a camera card or similar. And finally, I will just say this HDMI logo is a sticker, so it can just be easily peeled off and removed, which is something I'll probably be doing because I don't really need to be advertising HDMI in my living room. Now looking at the back of the device and going from left to right, so we have HDMI 2, similar to the Skylake unit or the Intel NUC I have here, but obviously this is an HDMI 2 port. We have DisplayPort, which I believe is DisplayPort 1.4. We also have a USB-C port, which according to the little logo here can handle DisplayPort output. So, actually probably better output here than just the single mini DisplayPort on the NUC. Similarly, we have vent here for the cooler, similar to what you'd find on the NUC. Ethernet, same across both, and I believe that this is, gigabit port on this. Pair of USB-C, USB-A 3 ports, and these are again 3.2 Gen 1 ports, and then just our power. Otherwise, sort of notes on the appearance, so this fits in better for me than the sort of 2-colour finish on the NUC. Just because I have an old PlayStation and a Fire TV, so I have a lot of black AV kit, and the NUC with this silver finish always kind of stood out. I know you can get darker colour NUCs now as well, but this was what was available to me at the time. Size-wise, they are both about 120 millimeters wide, 50 millimeters tall, or if you want it in old money, 4 inches by 2 inches, I believe it is, or 5 inches by 2 inches. I'm not good on those measurements. The NUC, I would say, has a little more weight to it just because of the metal construction, but quite similar devices, obviously aimed at the same sort of segment and uses. For me, besides just the better hardware, I think the ASUS probably edges ahead just on aesthetics and ports that it has available. So access into the unit is then done by the 4 screws on the base. These long screws go all the way down through the chassis. And obviously this is essentially the guts of a laptop put into a small cube chassis, so we fit largely notebook style components. There isn't a huge amount because obviously things like wireless card are all integrated. When we then push this out this way and lift off, so this takes off effectively the side of the unit and gives us access to the internals. To then build our system, the first thing that we are going to do is to add our DDR4 memory modules. I have gone for Crucial Ballistics DDR4 3200 modules, as that should give us sort of optimal performance for this. You could go with faster memory modules, they may potentially be supported, but for my usage I'm not too worried about having disproportionately expensive memory, especially with the 4300U. Originally I was planning on buying the 4700U version of this, but just couldn't get stock in reasonable time here in the UK. So those slot in here, click down like normal laptop memory. If we were going to install a SATA 2.5 inch drive, then this goes in on this top section here, and yeah, I haven't checked the mounting mechanism thoroughly because you know, it's 2020, we go with gum sticks these days with our M2 modules. And speaking of which, it did actually confuse me slightly when I first opened this up. The M2 slot sits in here with the module then mounting over the top of the wireless card, and funnily this is actually an Intel AX200 wireless card in here, so it supports 802.11ax or Wi-Fi 6. And so to insert that, we slot it in, press down, and then we will find our little retention screw from the kit. And just for the sake of thoroughness, I've taken a look. So installing a 2.5 inch hard drive or SSD is done by taking a drive, inserting it into the lid that slides off, screwing it in on these mounting points here, and then it just connects up to the SATA connector when you put the lid on. This is just an old spare SSD I have lying around, not one I'm going to be using in this, as I just want to use the NVMe drive. In terms of other components, there isn't a great deal to change in here. The APU itself is mounted on the other side of the board with the cooler. I'm not going to be taking that apart because really, particularly on a brand new unit, there is no reason for me to be doing that. So with that looked at, all that's left to do now is to re-sight the base, slide it back into place and screw it back down, and then you can rejoin us and we will take a look at the BIOS. So booting into the UEFI BIOS, and we can see that unlike the NUCs, which have a graphical interface, this is a strictly old school text-based affair. And the options on it are very limited from a performance standpoint. This really is a business orientated box. So most of the options that we find in here we have here options around management, and here again some for the Realtek firmware control, trusted computing, disabling various devices or enabling. Most of these are disabled by default, This is all pretty much running on the default configuration. We can turn off things like USB ports. There is UEFI networking and so on. So really this is focusing on the ability to lock this down. One thing I will turn on is HDMI CEC support, so it can link up with my telly to switch it to the correct input. So that gives us some other options. We also have, it detects here the NVMe drive. On the opening page, confusingly, it shows M2 as not detected, of course because that's SATA information, and then some power and other platform configuration options. The only options we have for the performance or the thermals of the system really are we have fan control settings for normal, quiet or performance. So if you want to minimize temperatures and potentially improve performance, you can adjust that. Or if you're using it in a noise sensitive environment, you can use the quiet mode. I will take a look and see if that also affects the performance of the system as well. And then we have our standard boot options and the flash tool. So really, because this is a business focused machine, nothing in terms of RAM speed or CPU overclocking or turbo or anything like that is purely focusing on the management of the machine in a business environment. Turning our attention to the details of the system itself, and as you can see here in CPU-Z, we have the Ryzen 3 4300U. I have updated the BIOS on this machine. There aren't a huge number of updated BIOSes from ASUS, but I have boosted it with the latest. And first of all, I want to just look at the memory. And what we will see here is, despite fitting 3200 modules, it runs at DDR4 2666 speeds. This was obviously fairly disappointing, as ASUS actually in their marketing claimed DDR4 3200, but looking elsewhere, other people report the same. So it supports the modules, which of course it does, it's just downclocking them. But even though looking here, we can see it is 3200 in the XMP settings, albeit with an increased voltage, it's just using the JEDEC standard timings for the module and running it at the lower speed. This is obviously disappointing, having spent the money on the faster memory, so I might well cycle it into another system that supports it and fit 2666 modules into this system instead. Otherwise, we can see we have the AMD Radeon graphics. They don't brand it as Vega on these chips, it's just branded as Radeon. And this has a slightly decreased number of compute units versus the 4500U, along with only being a quad-core non-SMT chip, so you only get 4 threads on this processor. Looking now at CineBench, and what we can see here is, having already run the test because CineBench R20 is quite long, we get 1600 points in the multi-threaded test and 423 in the single, which gives us a 3.78 times speed up. That's obviously as you would expect, because you will get some higher clock speeds running on the single core, whereas the clock speeds will be reduced on quad core, but still a good ratio on that. And if we run it, I did test this on the different fan speeds, and to be honest, did not see huge differences in performance, barely any, in fact. Weirdly, also not much difference in noise. It's possible at idle, the system perhaps lets itself run a little hotter and reduces noise in those scenarios, but looking at how it runs during this full load test, it goes up to 28 watts, 27 watts in the early stages of the test, and then drops to 15 watts as it comes out of those boost frequencies on the clock speed. So we can see here it starts off at around 3.8 gigahertz, and then we'll gradually taper that down as the activity persists and the temperature rises. So once it starts getting hot, it's going to ramp the speed of the fan up anyway. It doesn't limit that turbo frequency. If you put it in quiet mode, it performs the same in any way. Turning our attention to media playback here, and obviously I'm limited in choice by the fact that I'm using an HDMI capture card, and Netflix and so on will not like me connecting that up with HTCP, limiting the ability to capture anything and not wanting to get copyright struck from recording off of the screen with these things. So we are just using the very social media friendly Big Buck Bunny, and we are, as you can see from the stats here, we are running the 4K 60Hz version of this cartoon, and we can see the very occasional dropping of frames, although we are scaling it down here, and again because of the capture card capturing at 1080p, not 4K. But overall, other than say when we put it full screen there or do other bits and pieces, we get some little drop frames, but on the whole it is maintaining good smooth playback at the 60Hz. I have tested this on my 4K screen in the office as well, and exactly the same performance on that when actually outputting at 4K through the DisplayPort connector to my monitor. So no issues with the video playback on here, in this case using the VP9 codec. Moving over to H.265 decoding, and we can see here using a 200 megabits Ultra HD HVEC 10-bit encoded version of the jellyfish sample video, that this is placing minimal demands on the processor and occupying the video engine of the AMD Radeon graphics, and is delivering pretty smooth playback on this. I think there may be a little bit of stuttering. Again, it seems to be induced by my capture card in this capture. Playing back through the monitor, it was all pretty good. So as a option for a media center system sitting under your TV, I think this would be a pretty good choice given its performance on what is a fairly intensive test. Finally, we're going to just run a quick game test looking at Grand Theft Auto 5. Again, just to get this set up properly, I'm running it windowed borderless and on the 1080p resolution. The default settings, which are in a lot of cases above the minimums, but no anti-aliasing or any features like that. And I am applying a render scale to reduce the resolution effectively to 720p. We'll see here, because I have 16 gigabytes of video memory installed, the APU can essentially use about 8 gigabytes of that. In reality, most of the time its allocation is far less. I believe Task Manager was saying 512 megabytes. It can just scale that up as it is needed, I believe. But we will run the test and see how performance is. And so in the main portion of the GTA 5 test, we can see here frame rates are almost always above 30 frames per second. So if we were enabling the half VSync mode in this, it would lock that to 30 frames per second. There are some drops and stutters in places, depending on the amount of action on screen. The frame rate will rise and fall. Obviously, if you wanted to lock it to 60 frames per second, you could reduce the detail level or use that render scale to pull things down a little lower. But it's certainly a experience that I would say is better than I've had on the similar Intel NUCs. And although not the strong point of a machine like this, and certainly not something you'd buy as a gaming system, for casual gaming it is going to be a usable option. I hope you found this video useful. If you have any questions about the unit, do ask in the comments below. Hit subscribe if you'd like to see more videos as we post them. We will be posting some with Tiger Lake Intel chips in the near future, comparing those to the Renoir processors as well. And yeah, give it a like if you found this helpful. Thanks for watching.